There is a moment, and most people never recognize it when it happens, where a man quietly gives up on himself. Not all at once, not dramatically. He does not announce it. He does not cry. He simply starts accepting less. He sleeps a little longer. He delays a little more. He tells himself that tomorrow is a better day to begin, and tomorrow agrees. And then tomorrow becomes a year, and then a decade. This is not weakness in the way most people imagine weakness. It is something quieter and far more dangerous. It is the slow erosion of identity that happens when a man stops holding himself to any standard at all. This video is not here to motivate you. Motivation is a fire that burns out. What we are going to discuss is something far older, far more durable, and far more demanding than motivation. We are going to talk about discipline, not the discipline of productivity culture or morning routines listed in self-help books, but the discipline that samurai philosophers described as the very architecture of a worthy life. The kind of discipline that does not ask how you feel. The kind that does not negotiate with your comfort. The kind that, once understood and embodied, does not leave you when things become difficult. We begin with a man named Daniel. He is 34 years old, lives alone in a modest apartment in a mid-sized city, and for the past 3 years has been slowly disappearing. Not physically, professionally, socially, spiritually. He had once been someone who made plans and followed through on them. He had once trained regularly, read seriously, shown up consistently. And then, after a series of losses, a failed business, a difficult relationship, the death of someone close, he stopped. And the world, as it always does, continued moving. And Daniel stood still and called it rest, when in truth he had simply stopped fighting. His story is not unusual. In fact, it is perhaps the most common story of our time. And it is the story we will return to throughout this video. Not because Daniel is a victim, but because Daniel is the student. And the teaching that finds him comes from a tradition over 400 years old. It comes from the philosophy of the samurai. And it begins, as all serious things begin, with a reckoning. Chapter 2. The Way of the Warrior. What Bushido actually means. Most people in the modern world have heard the word Bushido. They have seen it on tattoos, on the covers of books attached to combat sports. But the word is rarely understood in its full weight. Bushido, the way of the warrior, was not a fighting philosophy. It was not a system for winning battles. It was a moral and existential framework for how a human being ought to live when they have accepted the reality of death. The samurai did not train so that they could survive. They trained so that when the moment of their death arrived, they would be worthy of it. That distinction is everything. The foundational text that many scholars point to when discussing samurai philosophy is the Hagakure, compiled in the early 18th century by a samurai retainer named Yamamoto Tsunetomo. The book opens with one of the most confrontational sentences in the history of philosophical literature. The way of the samurai is found in death. For centuries, people have misread this as a celebration of violence or a reckless indifference to life. But Tsunetomo was saying something far more precise. He was saying that a man who has genuinely accepted that he will die, who has sat with that truth and allowed it to rearrange his priorities, is the only man capable of living fully and acting without hesitation. The man who clings to his life above all else becomes a prisoner of his own fear. And a prisoner cannot move freely. A prisoner cannot commit completely. A prisoner cannot live with discipline, because discipline requires the willingness to pay a price. and a man afraid of loss will never willingly pay any price at all. This is where Daniel's story becomes instructive. Daniel had not accepted loss. He had been wounded by it and had retreated from it. His discipline collapsed, not because he was lazy at his core, but because he had never built it on a foundation that could survive difficulty. He had built his discipline on comfort, on the idea that he would do the work when conditions were good, when he felt ready, when life cooperated. And the samurai tradition tells us with great clarity that this is not discipline at all. That is preference, and preference dissolves the moment circumstances change. True discipline, in the samurai sense, is built not on feeling, but on commitment. And the commitment is made not to an outcome, but to a way of being. Tsunetomo did not say, "Train when you feel strong." He did not say, "Hold to your principles when it is easy to do so." He said that the warrior's way must be decided in advance, and then lived regardless of what life brings. This is the first and most important distinction between the philosophy we are exploring and everything you will find in the ordinary discourse about self-improvement. Chapter 3: Miyamoto Musashi and the Discipline of Elimination. If Tsunetomo gave us the spiritual framework of samurai discipline, then Miyamoto Musashi gave us its practical geometry. Musashi was perhaps the greatest swordsman who ever lived in Japan. He was undefeated in over 60 duels, several of which took place against multiple opponents simultaneously. But the legacy that Musashi left was not his victory count. It was a small, spare book he wrote in a cave in the final years of his life, shortly before his death, which he titled Gorin no Sho, the Book of Five Rings. And the philosophy in that book is, at its heart, a philosophy of ruthless elimination. Musashi lived his entire adult life without a permanent home, without a wife, without decorations, without attachments. He was not doing this to perform asceticism. He was doing it because he understood something that very few people ever confront: that every attachment, every comfort, every habit of avoidance that we accumulate over a lifetime becomes a weight. And a weighted man cannot move with the speed and clarity that mastery requires. Musashi wrote, "You must understand that there is more than one path to the top of the mountain." But he also understood that no path goes up without requiring you to put things down. Every serious ascent involves serious elimination. Daniel, sitting in his apartment 3 years into his quiet surrender, had accumulated weight of a different kind. He had accumulated the weight of options, dozens of apps, dozens of subscriptions, dozens of half-started projects, and abandoned interests. He had more stimulation available to him than any human being in history, and yet he was profoundly, desperately bored. He was bored in the way that only overstimulated people become bored, with a restlessness that feels like emptiness, with a hunger that eating only makes worse. He scrolled through his evenings and called it relaxing. He watched other people's lives and called it connection. And every morning, he woke up slightly less certain of who he was. Musashi would have recognized this immediately. The swordmaster's first diagnosis would not have been that Daniel needed more discipline, more ambition, more goals. The diagnosis would have been that Daniel needed less. Musashi's philosophy of discipline begins not with addition, but with subtraction. Before you can sharpen anything, you must know what you are sharpening. Before you can commit to a path, you must be willing to stop walking all the others. The warrior does not divide himself. The warrior consolidates. He identifies what is essential and removes everything that is not because the other things are evil, but because they are diluting, and dilution is the death of mastery. Chapter 4: The Discipline of the Body as the Discipline of the Mind. There is a principle in Zen Buddhism that was deeply woven into samurai training, and that remains one of the most misunderstood ideas in all of Eastern philosophy. The principle is that the body and the mind are not separate. This sounds simple. Most educated people in the modern world would nod at that statement and move on. But they would move on without understanding what it actually demands of them. Because if the body and mind are genuinely not separate, if they are expressions of the same underlying reality, then the way you treat your body is not a physical health decision. It is a metaphysical statement about who you are. The samurai did not train the body merely to produce a capable fighter. The samurai trained the body because they understood that the qualities that arise through physical discipline, patience, tolerance of discomfort, the ability to continue when the impulse to stop is screaming, are the same qualities that govern a man's conduct in every other domain of life. You cannot be disciplined in your mind while being permissive with your body. The Zen masters who trained alongside warriors understood this. When a monk sat in meditation for hours without moving, despite aching legs and restless thoughts, he was not merely meditating. He was building the muscle of endurance that would serve him everywhere. The body is not separate from the practice. The body is the practice. Daniel had stopped moving his body. This may seem like a small thing, a lifestyle choice, a temporary phase. But in the context of this philosophy, it was not small. His physical passivity had become inseparable from his mental passivity. He noticed that he was slower to make decisions, slower to act on them, quicker to abandon discomfort of any kind. He had stopped sitting with difficulty in his body and simultaneously lost the capacity to sit with difficulty in his mind. His thoughts scattered. His attention refused to hold. He was living in a kind of permanent comfort that had become, through accumulation, its own form of suffering. The Zen tradition has a word for this state. It is called muddled sleep. Not sleep that restores, sleep that sedates. A comfortable stupor from which no clear thinking or meaningful action can arise. The prescription that the samurai tradition offers here is not complicated, but it is uncompromising. Begin with the body. Begin with something physical and non-negotiable, not a goal, not a challenge, but a practice. Something you do every single day, not because you are trying to lose weight or build muscle or compete, but because you have committed to no longer being a person who avoids discomfort. The practice itself is almost secondary. What matters is the daily act of choosing difficulty over ease in at least one domain of physical life. That act, repeated without exception, begins to rebuild something essential. It begins to rebuild the self-narrative, the internal story that says, I am someone who does what I said I would do. Chapter 5. Silence, Stillness, and the Warrior's Inner World. One of the most striking things about the samurai tradition, when you study it closely, is how much of it is not about action. We imagine the samurai as a figure of decisive, explosive movement, and there is truth in that image. But the training that produced that decisiveness was, in large part, a training in stillness. The great swordsmen were expected to spend enormous portions of their lives in silence, in meditation, in contemplation, in the cultivation of what the Zen tradition calls mushin, which translates roughly as no mind. Not emptiness in the nihilistic sense, but a quality of awareness so clear and so uncluttered that it could respond to reality without the distortion of anxiety, preference, or hesitation. Mushin is not a mystical state available only to monks and masters. It is, at its foundation, a description of what happens when a person has so thoroughly internalized their discipline that they no longer have to think about it. The musician who has practiced a piece of music 10,000 times does not think. This is what the samurai tradition promises through its discipline of silence. Not comfort, not happiness in the ordinary sense, but clarity. The warrior who has learned to be still in his interior life carries that stillness into every room he enters. He is not agitated by the noise of other people's opinions. He is not thrown by setbacks because he has sat with discomfort deliberately and knows its textures. He is not desperate for distraction because he has faced himself honestly and found that the self, when stripped of its defenses, is not something to flee from. It is something to stand within. The discipline of silence is ultimately the discipline of self-acquaintance, and self-acquaintance is the beginning of all genuine self-mastery. Chapter 6. The Principle of Kaizen, the accumulation of small things. There is a Japanese concept called Kaizen, which means continuous improvement through small, incremental, non-negotiable steps. The word became well known in the context of manufacturing and business philosophy in the 20th century, but its roots are much older and much deeper than corporate strategy. The underlying philosophy of Kaizen, that transformation is not the result of dramatic gestures, but of the faithful accumulation of small correct actions, is woven throughout samurai culture, Zen practice, and Japanese aesthetic tradition. It appears in the way a swordsman was trained, not by attempting complex combinations first, but by performing the most basic cut 10,000 times until it was perfect. It appears in the way a Zen garden is maintained, not through occasional bursts of effort, but through daily attention to small details. It appears in the Japanese concept of shokunin, the artisan who dedicates an entire life to mastering a single craft, finding dignity not in variety but in depth. The modern world is allergically opposed to Kaizen in practice, even while celebrating it in theory. We are oriented toward the dramatic transformation, the 30-day challenge, the total reinvention, the complete overhaul of habits and identity in a single motivational surge. And these things have a feeling of power about them. They produce excitement and the temporary clarity that comes with any new commitment. But the samurai tradition tells us something uncomfortable about dramatic gestures. They are in most cases a form of avoidance. The person who commits to a total lifestyle reinvention is often unconsciously avoiding the quieter and more demanding work, which is to simply do the right small thing today, and then again tomorrow, and then again the day after, without fanfare, without audience, without any particular feeling of progress. Daniel had done this before, the dramatic gesture. In the year after his losses, he had signed up for 3 different programs, purchased a great deal of equipment and reading material, and announced to himself on multiple occasions that things were changing. And each time, the announcement faded and the equipment sat unused and the programs went unfinished, because they had all been built on enthusiasm rather than principle. The samurai tradition would not have condemned Daniel for these attempts. It would simply have pointed out that a warrior does not prepare for battle by getting excited about it. A warrior prepares for battle by training, quietly, daily, without drama, until training is no longer a decision he makes, but a rhythm he inhabits. The practice Daniel eventually built was almost embarrassingly simple. He did not need complexity, because complexity had always been one of his mechanisms for delay. He would over-engineer the plan until it collapsed under its own weight. Instead, he chose 3 small actions. He would wake at the same time. He would move his body. He would sit in silence. Not because these 3 things would change his life immediately, but because these 3 things, done without exception, would begin to change his identity. An identity, in the samurai framework, is the deepest form of discipline. Because once you know clearly who you are, the actions that align with that identity become not obligations, but expressions. The warrior does not force himself to be honorable. Honor is what he is. The discipline is in protecting the clarity of that self-knowledge against everything that would blur it. Conclusion: the decision that changes everything. In the end, all of this philosophy, all of Musashi and Tsunetomo and Dogen and the centuries of warrior wisdom distilled into these principles, points to a single decision, not a complicated decision, not a dramatic one, a quiet, private decision that you make in the ordinary moments of your ordinary life, when no one is watching and nothing external is forcing you, when you could easily choose the easier thing and no one would ever know. The decision is simply this: I will not disappear from my own life. I will be present. I will hold to what I believe. I will do the work. I will show up as the person I have chosen to be, regardless of how I feel about it today. The samurai called this the warrior's resolve. They understood that it was not made once and kept forever effortlessly. It was renewed every morning. It was tested every day, and it was deepened slowly and irrevocably every time a person honored it in a moment when abandoning it would have been easy. That accumulation of small honorings, that daily faithfulness to the self one has chosen to become, is the path. The path does not end. There is no summit at which the discipline is no longer necessary. There is no point at which the warrior may put down his practice and rest indefinitely. But there is something that grows with every step of the path, a quality of quiet, unshakable confidence that has nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with integrity. The confidence of a person who knows that when difficulty arrives, they will not fold, because they have practiced not folding, because they have built the kind of character that holds. It is walked today by every person who, in the quiet of an ordinary morning, chooses to begin again. Not dramatically, not perfectly, but truly. Take what is useful from what you have heard. Leave what does not serve you. And then, with whatever clarity you have found, go and live accordingly. That is all the teaching ever asks.